Kevin Pelton is here. He's going to talk a little bit more about the plan for the 76ers. I mean, everybody likes the Sixers situation here because they've got all the money, Kevin Pelton. They have the cap space. They're a good team. So it seems that every free agent is going to be connected to Philadelphia in some way, shape, or form. So how much of the stuff that we're hearing right now with Philadelphia, Paul George, Jimmy Butler, Brandon Ingram, and just about anybody else, should we take seriously?
Well, they can't all be true at the same time, I suppose.
Right.
I mean, the interesting thing about this, I think, from Philly's perspective, is that you have like so many different options to sort through. It's almost more of a challenge than a team that, you know, if you had precisely just the $40 million salary spot or whatever, and you're like, okay, we can fit one guy into this spot. In Philly's case, there's just a lot of moving parts because it's not only potentially one of these high salary players, it's how do we bring back some of our own guys to fill in those other spots around him, because this is the closest we've had really potentially to a blank slate going into cap space in a long period of time. It was pretty common, you know, back in the day. I remember what the Lakers had, I think, like LaMarcus Aldridge, and I forget who even the other max player was, but it was going to be Kobe and those two guys and everyone else on minimums, because that's how they were going to have to make it work cap-wise back then. And that used to be fairly common because we saw so many stars hit free agency. What makes Philly unique is we have not seen a good team with max-level cap space since really, I think, 2019.
So you have Embiid and you have Maxey, we think. Maxey will sign eventually. What is the best case scenario to get this thing going if you're Daryl Morey? What do you think Daryl Morey's hoping for when Sunday comes around?
I mean, I think Daryl's MO has always been star players because they tend to historically be underpaid relative to their contribution. And then I think the other thing that, you know, you can believe if you're Morey in the Sixers front office is we are uniquely capable of going out and finding role players to put around stars. We signed Kelly Oubre Jr. for the minimum last year and watched him have this terrific starting season. So if we get those guys in place, we're going to figure out the rest of the roster, even if maybe it takes a year or two to quite get the kind of depth you'd need to really contend at the highest level. And that's tough at Joel Embiid's age and, you know, Paul George's age in this scenario. But I think he has to be the plan A, because other than LeBron James, who has not been linked to Philly, he's the best guy who might change teams.
So you would be an advocate, if you're Daryl Morey, of signing Paul George as a free agent. What if he opts back in, gets the $48 million, and then the trade scenario? Are you as interested if you have to trade a draft pick to get him?
Less interested, and I don't think it makes sense. If you're Paul George, the opt-in scenario, the reason it works is because all of a sudden I don't have to consider just teams that have cap space. I can consider, you know, a trade to the Knicks, let's say. That's one scenario that they mooted on the low post last week, who could never sign you outright for anything close to your max, but could put together a trade for you. I just don't think Philly that would happen, because there wouldn't be that much benefit to Paul George of doing it, and it certainly wouldn't be a benefit to the Sixers of giving up a draft pick for him.
Kevin Pelton, ESPN.com, looking at all the Sixers scenarios, which there are a ton. A lot of this is because they got the Tobias Harris deal finally off of their books, which has given them the chance to go into another direction. So Paul George is a free agent. He would be at the top of the list. But what about the Jimmy Butler, Brandon Ingram, that type of guy who wants more money, their team's not interested, and now they become trade candidates? Is that something that is maybe more desirable to Philadelphia?
I don't think more desirable, because the beauty of going out and signing a player in free agency is you get to keep those draft picks and save them for whatever else is in store, and you still have the player. Butler is an interesting one. You know, I understand the appeal to the Sixers. Obviously, it's the path not taken back when they did re-sign Tobias Harris instead of him. You're not necessarily getting the Jimmy Butler of the past, 4 seasons or 5 seasons or however long it's been in Miami thus far. You're
5 miserable years with Tobias Harris here.
You're getting the Jimmy Butler of, the next couple of seasons that he's under contract, plus the extension that you're going to have to give him if you're acquiring him in a deal like this. And that player, Is he going to fit as well at this stage of his career with Embiid, given the non-shooting and Tyrese Maxey? And is it going to be worth giving up all the draft picks? I'm a little more skittish about that scenario unless you start to strike out on a lot of things in free agency. Ingram, to me, is interesting. He also carries, I think, some fit issues because he's somebody who, much like, I guess, a younger Tobias Harris, really likes to play with the ball in his hands a lot in a way that you wouldn't if you're playing with Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. But he can shoot the three. He, could be a scorer on the second unit when he's playing alongside just one of those guys as opposed to two other ones in the starting lineup. And although you're still looking at, I think, a similar size extension potentially, this season his cap hit is so much lower than Jimmy Butler and Paul George that if it's Brandon Ingram that you're taking into cap space, it gives you a lot more spending power. But the flip side of those trades is, look, New Orleans and Miami aren't making these trades just to create giant trade exceptions or to create cap space. They're going to want players in return. And that's where it's an interesting scenario because there almost has to be a third or maybe even a fourth team involved has no players available to give you.
Right. Philadelphia's roster is barren. They don't have players to include in a trade. I guess Paul Reed might be a possibility at $7 million there. Kevin Pelton, ESPN.
The Pelicans.
Yeah, and the whole, the Miami thing is interesting because, generally, I guess you could have a 3-team deal with Butler going to Philly, Ingram going to Miami, and then the draft picks going with Philadelphia, giving the draft picks to New Orleans. Like, would those 3 teams acquiesce in that matter?
I think it makes some sense. I still think, though, you need a fourth team.
Yeah.
Because, again, New Orleans wants, whether it's a center to replace Jonas Valanciunas, who's hitting free agency, or, some kind of a long-term upgrade on the wing. They're not going to be doing this, again, just for cap space because they wouldn't really create much of it.
So the Sixers have the cap space. It's not a great free agent class. So what happens if you strike out on Paul George? You can't consummate a trade. What happens next? Where are you if you're Daryl Morey in that situation with, hey, I got a bag of money and I got nobody at this point? Like if George ends up opting in, getting traded, and you can't work out a deal, is that still a desirable spot for them?
So I don't know if any of your listeners are also listeners to the Dunked On NBA podcast. We annually do this mock-off season where each of us, 3 of us take over 10 different teams, and then Nate is the host, serves as the player agent. And I had the Sixers this year, so I was in that position. Went after Paul George, didn't get him. Went after OG Anunoby, didn't get him. He stayed with the Knicks. And my plan C in that scenario was to go heavily after Malik Monk. Now, based on the fact that Monk already re-signed with the Kings, has agreed to re-sign for the largest deal they could offer him, 4 years, $78 million, a lot less than I offered him, for the record, in that mock-off season, is a result of a bidding war. It seems maybe that wasn't the Sixers' direction. I mean, the other scenario that was a little tougher to do there is I think then you start to look, I think, a lot more at the trade market and breaking this up into several more manageable salaries. Because, as much as Sixers fans, I think, are dreaming of the fact that, oh, we've had Tobias Harris making all this money, and now he comes off the cap. The flip side of it is you had Kelly Oubre making the minimum. You had DeAnthony Melton making $8 million. Pending his health, he probably gets more than that in free agency if he's recovered reasonably from this back injury that sidelined him most of last season. Obviously, Tyrese Maxey's salary is eventually going up as part of this deal you complete last. So I do think it does produce a little bit less spending power than you'd think, and it's maybe not 4 or 5 guys coming in to fill in around Embiid and Maxey. Maybe it's 3 guys splitting up that cap space and kind of trying to look at, Derek Jones Jr., I think, is someone else who would make some sense after the way he played in Dallas. If you could outbid what the Mavericks are able to offer him using the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. Caleb Martin from Miami would be another guy in kind of that range who makes some sense as a fit, but it might not be enough spending power to go out and get, like I said, 4 or 5 of those guys.
Yeah, well, if that ends up being the case, and the guys you just mentioned, while nice players, would that be an awful scenario for Daryl Morey to have this money? Because part of the frustration for a lot of Sixers fans has been, hey, Daryl Morey, what has he really done? And to which I would say, well, he got handed kind of a pretty lousy deck that he untangled with the Al Horford deal, the Richardson deal. He has got himself cap space end picks. But if he can't do anything with it, like at what point do you start holding his feet to the fire and say, hey, we've given you 4 years. Now's your opportunity. If this isn't a successful offseason, how does that look for him?
I think the answer to this question is it doesn't matter what any of us think. Even the Philly sports fan community, it matters what Joel Embiid thinks. Because if Joel Embiid starts to question his ability to win in Philadelphia, that's when you have the problem. Like Embiid is the target audience for all of these moves. So I think the scenario that, if they aren't able to make a big addition in free agency, the scenario that you start to go back and wonder about is, should they have tried to trade Tobias Harris with those draft picks as an expiring contract for players who were under contract last offseason, and then, or at the trade deadline, and then you could have approached this summer over the cap rather than creating cap space and just tried to use bird rights to re-sign a lot of those guys. It's possible that scenario could have ended up with more spending power for the Sixers than what they'll get out of this cap space.
How valuable is Wednesday night for Philly? If you have this 16, is this a night where they can and should be active?
It's interesting. I think so. One scenario here is if you're trying to create more cap space, maybe you move down a few times, kind of piecemeal, and try to get second round picks out of this, because not only, do become very useful to you in terms of managing the luxury tax because they're making less than the guy I would be looking at for the Sixers, I haven't had a chance to talk about this, but I've been thinking about it for a while, is Zach Edey from Purdue. Because even though he doesn't fill a lot of those, like you've got that empty roster and you're just staring at it like it's better than any other. It's on a team where they've constantly struggled to, find ways to be successful with Joel Embiid on the bench. They have dealt with Joel Embiid's, availability being an issue at times. Like, who better to fill that than Zach Edey, as someone who you can kind of build that entire non-Embiid offense around him. And the nice thing about it is, I think that's going to be difficult for some teams to do because you have to kind of play one style of play with your starters and then this totally different style of play when you start dumping the ball to Edey in the post against second units. Well, Philadelphia, who's already doing that, Joel Embiid's more versatile. It's, a lot of face-ups at the elbow, pick and rolls, that sort of thing. But they're built to space around a center in the post in a way that almost no other team is going to be. So I think Zach Edey is, if I'm Philadelphia, at the top of my board by far.
Yeah, he also has a connection with Nick Nurse, who coached the Canadian team, so he's worked with Edey before. That was where I was going to go next is, Kevin, over the years, the Sixers, like if a plan B could be, hey, we don't get Paul George, maybe we get like the group of like Nick Claxton and Contavious Caldwell-Pope, and like, because I say Claxton just because the backup center has just been such a problem for this team, and we saw what happened. Like Hartenstein killed them last year, getting an active guy, that can take some center minutes away. Could that be like a plan C, is like, hey, let's dump the money into a player like Claxton, or is he going to be too price himself out of that like plan B or C type of situation?
Yeah, I think so, because you're looking at that point, the alternative, the scuttle with Claxton has been something like 4 years, $90 million, which is what he ended up going for in our mock-off season. So at that price point, you're choosing between Claxton and a starter at one of those other spots in all likelihood. What I like about Edey in particular is, anyone else you draft at 16 is not going to come in and start for you right away in all likelihood. I mean, maybe you hit a home run and get this year's equivalent of Jaime Jaquez Jr. in Miami or Brandon Pajemski in Golden State. But most likely it's someone you're looking at contributing 2 or 3 years down the road. And Edey can do it right away. And, obviously we know that Daryl's draft model is a big part of their draft process. And Edey blows away all the analytics models with his productivity at Purdue.
Lastly, Kevin, they have a ton of their own free agents, as we know, which is why they have a blank slate. Do you prioritize any of them, or do you already realize, hey, we took a shot with this team, we got knocked out in the first round, it's time to just start over again and try to replace, or are there guys on this team that played last year that you would prioritize?
Yeah, I wouldn't view it as start over, especially because this team was playing really well before Joel Embiid went out of the lineup. And, Nico Batum was a big part of that. DeAnthony Melton was a big part of that when he was healthy. His injury, I think, was along with Embiid's absence, a key to why they struggled so much in the second half and fell into the play-in. Fell into the play-in.
Mm-hmm.
So Melton, Batum, and Oubre would be the three guys that I would be prioritizing to try that bring back. And then Kyle Lowry is an interesting one, depending on what his price point is. If you can get him back using the non-bird rights to pay 120% of what he was making last year, that might be a good use of cap space as well.
Buddy Hield, no, not bringing him back then.
Lower on the list, I think that's just a situation where, I mentioned I went after Malik Monk. It's a position where you can probably get a little bit younger or a little bit better defensively. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a spot where even with Monk not on the market anymore, there's better free agents, I think, available at shooting guard. You mentioned Caldwell Pope is a realistic option. Then I think there are Klay Thompson, I suppose. It doesn't sound like at this point he's going back to Golden State. He'd be a little older maybe than you'd prefer, but probably a better defender than Buddy Hield and certainly more accomplished. I think there's more alternatives there than there are at the forward spots.
What would you project Oubre's going to get? He's an interesting guy, don't you think?
He is fascinating. I never would have expected that the market was so cool that he would end up signing for the minimum a year ago after averaging 20 points per game in Charlotte. I think he really proved something this year that he can contribute to a winning team. His on-ball defense against Jalen Brunson in the playoffs was really impressive. Does that get him up to 10 million a year, to 12 million, 15? I think somewhere in that range probably, but that's a pretty big jump from the minimum.
Yeah, he'll be an interesting one. I'm very intrigued. And then Kyle Lowry's another one. There's a lot of rumors that, buzz that he might come back, but that's not obviously probably wouldn't make a whole heck of a lot of money. But the Oubre one, I'll be interested to see if the Sixers can figure out a way to get him back. What do you think Tobias Harris gets on the market?
That's a fascinating one because I think a lot of people speculated for a long time about Detroit, the homecoming element there, and a team that had a lot of cap space. Now they've got new management. Trajan Langdon just took over as the team president, came in talking about we want to try to use our cap space to make trades and acquire bad salaries from other team and get draft picks, the Hinkie model, I suppose you can still say, rather than going out and spending it in free agency. So I still think he's accomplished enough that he probably ends up somewhere in that 15 million to 20 million range. But it's going to be interesting to see who that team is, where that money actually comes from.
Crazy. That one will be interesting. I'm sure Sixers fans will be pleased as punch when he finally signs someplace else. Although I guess there's a possibility in the George scenario that the Sixers could use him in a sign and trade situation. That would, I guess, be if you're trying to get Paul George in a trade, you can use maybe Harris and a draft pick and swap those two out, right?
Yeah, I think it would make more sense in the Brandon Ingram scenario we discussed. If New Orleans was interested in Harris as a replacement for Ingram, then maybe it's a fit because for the Clippers, the challenge of that would be if you take a player in a sign and trade, you hard cap yourself at the lower first apron, and that would really hamstring their ability to re-sign James Harden.
James Harden, right. All right, Kevin Pelton, plenty more. You like this draft or is it
I like some guys in this draft. They're not necessarily the guys everybody else likes, but I mentioned Edey that I'm relatively pretty high on, and Reed Shepherd and Donovan Clingan all do quite well in my.
Well, draft Wednesday night. You can hear that right here, and Thursday, by the way, 4 o'clock round 2. Kevin Pelton, ESPN.com. Check him out over there for all of the offseason coverage, the draft, free agency, and more. And he was kind enough to join us here on the Sports Bash on this Monday. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks for having me.